jobs entirely. That means a huge chunk of the country is now wondering how to pay the bills. Some have run out of money entirely, and they're hungry. Lines at food banks are the longest in nearly 100 years, since the Depression. So whatever you think of our uniquely generous immigration policy, and maybe you support it, it's pretty clear that right now is literally the last moment that unemployed Americans should have to be undercut by foreign nationals as they look for desperately needed jobs. It's obvious, and the president knows it well. Last night, without warning, he tweeted this, quote, "In light of the attack from the invisible enemy, as well as the need to protect the jobs of our great American citizens, I will be signing an executive order to temporarily suspend immigration into the United States," end quote. Well, that ricocheted around Twitter immediately. The announcement seemed to come out of nowhere, but in fact it didn't. Americans have been consistently demanding this, and it's measurable. A new Ipsos poll found that a remarkable 79% of all American adults support a temporary suspension of all immigration into the country for the duration of this pandemic. A Harvard-Harris poll found that 83% of adults, 83%, want a moratorium on immigration from Mexico. And by the way, these are not new sentiments. They've been around a long time. Another Harvard poll from 2 years ago found that 81% of voters wanted legal immigration cut to below its current level of about 1 million people a year. 63% wanted that number cut by half at least. In a country as divided as ours is right now, this is as close to a consensus as you're ever going to find about anything ever. If our democracy is real, and we're hoping it is, our leaders cannot continue to ignore what the public wants. And in this case, there's no question the president has the authority to do what he has done. Current federal law explicitly authorizes a president, any president, to suspend immigration into the country whenever he deems it detrimental to the interests of the United States. The people who wrote that law were very clear about why they did it. During hearings at the time, they explicitly pointed to epidemics and mass employment as the kind of crises that would justify cutting off immigration. Sound familiar? Of course it does. To most people, that makes utter sense. Why, in the middle of a disaster, would you make things worse? Why would you hurt your own people when they're already hurting? Even in Europe, that's very obvious to leaders. Many European countries have closed their borders during this disaster and are now making do with their own indigenous labor force. And yet some people in this country still oppose the idea. Who are these people and why do they oppose it? Well, people who've been pampered and enriched by waves of low-wage immigration, they're against it. Politicians whose hopes for power rest on changing this country's population oppose it too. They'd rather see Americans unemployed. In fact, anyone whose livelihood depends upon selling out the country is apt to be very threatened by this. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright is squarely in that category. Albright has spent the last 20 years bowing before and then profiting from the government of Communist China. Albright was one of the shills who lobbied for China's disastrous admission into the World Trade Organization 20 years ago. She's now appalled by the notion of cutting immigration during the worst unemployment crisis of our lifetimes. As she just explained on MSNBC, that's immoral.
How do you feel about the president's messaging on immigration?
Well, I'm stunned, and I really do think that the Statue of Liberty is weeping. It is un-American.
Got that? It's un-American to act in the economic interests of Americans. That's Madeleine Albright's position. But at least she'll say this for her. She seemed coherent as she said it. Former presidential candidate Robert Beto O'Rourke, who is technically unemployed himself, though still very rich, erupted in a primal scream when he heard the news. He tweeted this, quote, "Who the F do you think is working on the farms and feedlots and the packing houses and processing plants at a time when we are struggling to feed ourselves? Who is in the kitchen? Who is picking, preparing, serving the food we eat and cleaning up afterwards?" Well, honestly, those are all very good questions if you're an 18th century French marquis. As the country falls apart around him, Beteau's first and main concern is preserving America's sacred caste system. The native-born working on farms? In kitchens? In factories? Sacre bleu, screeched Beteau. It's unnatural, unthinkable, it is wrong. We must have a compliant underclass. We must. Who will iron the sheets? You can just imagine poor Beteau sitting alone in his study, fretting about the coming peasant rebellion. But it turns out he needn't have worried. Just before airtime, the president announced the substance of his executive order, and it's possible this will change. So we're just going on what we heard from the podium. But it's this. The new moratorium on immigration will last for 60 days, at which point it could be extended or it may not be extended. The ban will apply only to individuals seeking permanent residency in this country. In other words, people who like the United States enough to stay permanently and would like green cards to be able to do it legally. But the ban will not apply to those entering the United States on a temporary basis, and that means this will not affect guest workers. That's an awful lot of exceptions. Every year, our government hands out 80,000 non-agricultural guest worker visas, as well as 85,000 H-1B visas and hundreds of thousands of ag worker visas. The purpose of this tidal wave of immigration has nothing to do with what advocates of immigration claim immigration is for. These visas do not improve American society in any way. We have no moral obligation to give them. There is no mention of guest workers on the Statue of Liberty. There's only one point in handing out hundreds of thousands of these visas to foreign nationals, and it's to placate big business. Employers always and everywhere want to hire workers for less, in this case for less than Americans make, and these visas let them do it. And now they'll continue to do it at a time when more than 22 million Americans have just filed for unemployment. You may have just lost your job, but you'll be happy to know that Accenture can still import IT workers from Asia who will work for less than you once made. So if the point of this executive order was to protect American jobs, maybe there was another point, but if it was to protect American jobs, it failed. So how did this happen exactly? Well, we are not sure, though we do plan to find out. For now, we can make a few educated guesses. The first is this: the president is worried about preserving American jobs. He says that frequently to people around him. He clearly means it. He ran on that issue in 2016, and of course, he won on it. Unfortunately, and this seems to be the key, some in his orbit are not as concerned. Their main worry is making donors happy. And if there's one thing that donors love always, it's cheap employees. Yes, our middle class is dying at a faster clip than ever before. No, this will not help them. But that's not the problem of these advisors. They don't know many of these people personally anyway. These people may be poor, but they're not the fashionably poor, the ones people in Los Angeles write songs about or raise money for at mixers. They're just normal Americans whose lives and futures and families have taken a terrifying dive that they may not recover from. But whatever. Some of the people with influence hanging around the White House have more profound things to worry about right now than the fate of America's dying middle class. They're worried about whether their friends will approve of the president's latest executive order. That's their attitude. And it's that attitude that brought us where we are right now. Who are we talking about? We're not naming names tonight because we haven't confirmed who they are. More to come.